I feel like with risky decisions, we're often used to leaders wanting like ROI calculations or like show the numbers behind why this risk makes sense or not. And brand is one of the hardest things to measure. It's not impossible to measure. So like Shannon and I have rubrics and measurements and spreadsheets and formulas that we can show you. But like there's also like an intangible, immeasurable part of brand as well. And I think that's where it gets a bit more arduous when it comes to how much we have to educate folks on the true impact of brand and how brand works in those ways. Because I think when it comes to risk, one thing that helps make risk a bit more tolerable is to see the numbers and to understand what you're saying yes to and no to from a numbers perspective. And it shouldn't always be that way when it comes to brand decisions.
Welcome to the Product Tea with Leah. I am your host, Leah Dorin, and we are about to spill the tea with the best from tech about product growth and senior leadership topics. Good morning, everyone. Today we have a powerhouse creative duo, each with a rich background in shaping and growing iconic brands. She is a master brand builder whose expertise has been sought after by billion-dollar tech companies. Her artistic talents span across writing, creating, and even podcasting, having co-hosted a songwriting podcast for 7 years. She's also on the brink of publishing her first book, delving into her love for utopian themes. Probably that's not tech startups. And alongside her struggle to cultivate scallions in her urban dwelling. He, on the other hand, is known for crafting some of the kindest marketing teams around, contributing to the meteoric rise of brands like Buffer and managing the creative chaos at Vox. He thrives in early to expansion stage company environments, guiding them through their formative years with a blend of creativity and strategic insight. His current passions include exploring new caffeinated concoctions and indulging in pixel art created by his son, though he admits the high-octane drama of The Bear can be a bit much. Welcome to the Product Tea, Shannon Deep and Kevan Lee. It's very nice to have you. How are you doing this morning?
Thank you, Leah. Doing really well. Thanks.
Yeah, good, thanks.
Good, thanks. How would you rate this intro, Kevan, from 0 to 10?
Oh, well, I love being called a creative powerhouse or part of one. And yeah, you nailed everything else. That was great. I haven't been as prominent with my caffeinated concoctions yet. And so you've re-inspired me to go back to the well and find some more.
I was fully expecting, by the way, to stumble over that word, but
the alliteration is beautiful. So it was great.
Thank you very much. That means a lot to a dyslexic. That's very nice. Yeah. So let's just start off with maybe the first question. Can you both introduce yourself in a very few sentences and then we take it on from there? Shannon, can you go first, please?
Yeah, no problem. Hello, I'm Shannon Deep. As you mentioned, I work in branding. Right now, Kevan and I have our own branding agency. It's called Bonfire. Before that, both of us were in-house as marketers and branding experts at tech companies. And then before that, I was at a branding agency called Siegel and Gale, where I kind of like cut my teeth and like really learned how to do brand strategy, brand communication, all of that. And then my background is actually in the entertainment business. So I come from the theater world, behind the scenes of the theater world. And that's where I really learned how to tell compelling stories, which is like the red thread throughout my whole career. And that's what I bring to the table when we're in a branding engagement. So that's a little bit about me. I'll throw it over to Kevan.
Yeah. So like Shannon mentioned, I've been an in-house for a while, and now we're doing our own thing with our agency. And in-house, I worked at a company called Buffer, joined very early stage and got to see them through many years of growth. Then went to a company called Oyster, which is where I met Shannon. We also saw some incredible growth there and did some really cool work together. And prior to the tech world, I got my first marketing job in a multi-level marketing company. So I got to see that whole side of things, which is fascinating. And then prior to that, my background is in journalism. And so I went to school to get my journalism degree. I was a sports reporter. I made my own press pass to get into games for free. It was very lo-fi back in the day. So I'm glad to be on this side of the storytelling spectrum these days.
We should have ended the podcast right where you said multi-level marketing.
Yeah.
What do you want to know about it? Yeah, I can tell you everything.
It's all good. Usually when I introduce myself and I say I crashed 2 startups is also always a good point where you just like end it, right? Like it's just like, like, okay, let's just leave it at that. I think that's fine.
Yeah.
Well, it's very nice to have you both here. And I would like to also ask you and Kevan, this time you first maybe, what do people get wrong about you once they get to know you?
Yeah, I think it's that I have much harder opinions on things than it seems. And so I tend to keep my opinions like below the surface, which is not to say like you will hear my opinions on this podcast. I know that's not a good like podcasting thing to say out loud, as I don't say my hard opinions. I'll say them here, but in general, I think people would assume that I don't have hard opinions on things when actually I can be pretty opinionated.
So let me ask you a question. Like, assume you come home and your house is on fire. Are you the person that is just like calling someone else and says like, hey, it's a little bit warmer than it usually is around here? Or like, is that what you mean? Like, are you someone that is packaging stuff into nice words?
Yeah, I'm definitely diplomatic with that. Definitely cool under pressure. Like if a house is on fire, I think I would be pretty calm on the phone to 911. But also like if we're going out to eat and someone asks me where I want to eat, I probably have an opinion on where to eat, but I'm fine going with whatever anyone else says in that moment. So usually lower stakes opinions.
Yeah. So you cannot inconvenience others, right? Like you do not want to be a burden, right?
Ideally not. Yeah.
Oh my God. I know that feeling, you know?
That's the goal, kind of. Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay though. I appreciate that. Okay. Shannon, what about you?
Yeah, I think that people think I am a lot more serious than I actually am. I definitely do have that side of me. I think, like, especially in the workplace, it can come out where I can be all business, but actually, I am kind of a goofy nerd. I like Dungeons and Dragons. I like karaoke. I like, I don't know, just the things where I get to look ridiculous and where I get to show that I don't take myself very seriously. But I think that often surprises people if they just know me like in a professional context.
Did you ever play Dungeons and Dragons at the agency that you're working with or like with any clients?
Not with clients, but with former coworkers. So I used to work at a French password manager called Dashlane, which is why I live in Paris now. But my coworkers there were big D&D or like tabletop RPG players. So we played, I don't know if we actually ever played Dungeons and Dragons, but we played Warhammer and we played Blades in the Dark, which are two other systems, which were super fun.
Fantasy or a 40K?
I think it was the fantasy version. I only did like a little one shot, like one afternoon with some coworkers for that one. But yeah, loved it.
The Warhammer recording comes next time.
Okay, great.
Today, we're going to talk about the other side of your both careers. We're going to talk about MLM and theater, so a brand. So I have a very divided relationship when it comes to agencies. Sometimes when it comes to marketing agents specifically, there's always like a little bit of a hit and miss. And what I learned also earlier in my career was always that, you know, brand is an exercise that is usually a result of having a good product. And then a good connection to marketing, you know, like, and then also how you're selling it into the market, of course. And like this result of your efforts on a continuous basis are kind of defining your brand. And when we started to get together on like what we are going to record our podcast about, then you both suggested that we should talk about why everybody sucks at brand, specifically the senior leaders. So can you tell me what we are all getting wrong about brand? Because maybe I also have some war stories. So this would be quite interesting.
Yeah, we could probably swap some war stories. I don't know. Kevin was the one who kind of came up with this concept initially. And I was like, yes, that's a great concept. So I don't know, Kevin, if you had like something particular in mind when you said this, or did you just know it was going to be a rich vein for us to talk about with Leah?
I knew it would be a vein. And I think I probably have hard opinions on this too, that I'm happy to share with it. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is probably the most obvious, that a lot of senior leaders just think of brand as the pretty visuals and the design side of things. And Shannon and I are not designers, and yet we run a brand agency. And so if that was the extent of like what brand really is, we would be in big trouble. But I think that is often where people start when it comes to that conversation. So that's mistake number one, is conflating brand with purely just the design and logos and type and colors of the company.
Yeah, Kevin often says, and I think this definition of brand is really great, and it actually aligns kind of nicely with what you were saying, Leah, that brand is the sum total of all experiences that people have with your company. And so that could be positive and negative experiences. It could be things in your app. It could be things in your email marketing. It could be experiencing your brand out in the world when you see it on a t-shirt or you see it on a poster or in the subway advertising. It's the word of mouth that you might overhear, someone recommending you or someone telling another person not to use your app or your product over another app or product. And so the sum total of all those experiences is your brand. And so it does take a really concerted effort to shepherd that and to be intentional about that, because whether you are intentional or not, you will have a brand because your brand is just the experiences people have with your product and services and your communications and your interaction. If you aren't intentional about it, it's still happening. People are still having those experiences. And so you do need to be quite deliberate and quite thoughtful about how you like keep your hands around all of that. And so I think, yeah, building off what Kevan said, it's expanding the definition of brand to be more than just like something your marketing department does, because it is much deeper than that.
So I think I have a sentence that I just came up with that goes perfectly on a cup of tea that you can sell. So you can also keep the sentence if it's a good one.
Great.
I think because I'm only moving in B2B, of course, because the B2C peasants, they do not have enough money, right? Like these smaller companies like Netflix and so forth, they're just not, pockets are not deep enough. Okay, so what I'm thinking is that brand in some kind of way is the permission to play up market with other bigger players without having to prove everything over your product beforehand. With increasing price, you need to generate trust much more through some kind of measures and so forth. But I feel like brand, which can also be created exactly as you said, like with word of mouth, like, hey, Shannon, would you recommend I would do if I was going into theater and so forth, right? Like you're also like whatever you're going to communicate or like recommend to me is also going to profit from its own brand. So this is how I'm kind of like thinking about it as well. And what I'm wondering right now is that I talk a lot about ICPs, how we differentiate each other and so forth, right? Like, so like how do we create a brand that is actually not just like, oh, Leia, she's kind of nice, but something with like corners, like, and with a very clear outline on what it is and what she is not, right? So like sharpening sort of the lines. How do you think about this specifically as an agency that has to probably give some kind of service in this regard, and specifically about like what are the common talks that you have with leaders where it starts to get really difficult? Because I have some of these, but I would love to hear from you.
Yeah, well, we have a whole framework that helps create those corners and those outlines for companies and for individuals. And so for us, it comes down to being really clear about your purpose, your mission, and your values. That'll tie into an overall brand story that you want to be telling. And then from that brand story, you develop discrete narratives. Typically for companies, it's a narrative around your persona, it's a narrative around your product, it's a narrative around your category, and then a narrative around the larger culture zeitgeist as a whole. And so from those narratives, which are tied into your overall story, you're able to tell, really rich and detailed versions of what you believe. And you mentioned, like, I think we think of it in terms of who you're for and who you're not for. And that should be revealed within the story and within the narratives that you're choosing. And so giving a shape to the stories that you are telling makes it so much easier than to go out and just repeat those stories, tell them in compelling ways, be part of those conversations. It kind of takes this big picture, almost like a fuzzy sense of what people often associate with brand, and makes it much more real and tactical and practical. I think that's where the stuff really comes alive. And so we try to work with founders and CMOs to get them to come through that process with us. And I think what we find then is that once they know the process, great, the process is cool, but we will then, suggest some pretty differentiated and unique stories that they could be telling. And that's when the rubber hits the road, is like, oh, are they comfortable being this ambitious? Are they comfortable stretching to have a strong opinion on this or that? Or do they kind of want to just play it safe and get all the goodwill from brand without doing some of the hard work of taking a stand on these things? That's where it gets a little dicey.
So I have a provocative question in this regard. I don't disagree with anything that you said. So specifically around where the rubber meets the road. So let's say we have a company that says like, we have a brand. I mean, everybody does have a brand, but like our current brand is a bit too wishy-washy. We need to, I don't know, the CEO has listened to you on this podcast and said like, they know what they're talking about. We do not want to be wishies. We want to be either washies or this, right? Like, but we want to have a kind of decision. So let's say you get together, we have the vision, everything is kind of defined. The values is also probably a fun one that's also going to pop up occasionally. But now we're getting to the operative details. What does this mean? And I think, Kevan, you mentioned also like the operative expenditure of energy and money, right? So like how consistently are you now pursuing this and so forth? But here's my question. The thing that I always wonder about when you are either like an agency or I am also an agency in some kind of way, like I'm a solopreneur, where they not only have to do something, but they also have to stop doing something else. And that is usually saying no to a specific type of ideal customer profile that we're not serving anymore. And everything is fine until that point where you just say like, no, you're not that anymore. Just stop talking to these people. Stop selling to these people. Like, right? Like this is not your ICP. How do you balance this? Because this is the biggest kind of pushback that I see from founders. Everybody's happy to define missions and visions all day, but the moment where they have to implement it and delete specific things on their website, in their messaging, in the content that they produce, this is where it gets difficult. How do you navigate this?
Oh man, it's a really great question. And it's definitely like conversations we have because it's risk, right? You are taking a risk. You're making a bet. And like, hopefully you have a solid team, you've done solid research, you're working with a partner that you trust, and you can rally high conviction that the bet that you're taking, that the risk that you're taking is going to pay off in the long run. It's no different than, I think, any other strategic business decision where there is risk involved. And senior leadership, founding teams, executive teams, they're making those kinds of decisions every day. But I think when it comes to brand, everybody wants to have it all. Everybody wants their cake and eat it too. Everybody wants to say like, no, but actually we're just like for everybody. But brand benefits from the same kind of like clear-eyed, sharp, like strategic decision making that I do think executive teams make when they're talking about who their ICP is, when they're talking about like segmentation, when they're talking about like different parts of the funnel to target or what needs attention. But yeah, it's okay for brand to be divisive because brand is an additional filtering mechanism for getting the right people in the door. And I think that like opening the door to like just everyone is going to have like a lot of people who might feel like kind of okay about your product or company or service, but opening the door only for like the right people, you're going to have a much more engaged, much more interested, much more loyal customer base. And I think like in the way that you would make any quote unquote risky business decision, like those same kind of frameworks can be applied to brand as well. It's not outside those types of decisions.
Yeah. And I feel like with risky decisions, we're often used to leaders wanting like ROI calculations or like show the numbers behind why this risk makes sense or not. And brand is one of the hardest things to measure. It's not impossible to measure. So like Shan and I have rubrics and measurements and spreadsheets and formulas that we can show you. But like there's also like an intangible, immeasurable part of brand as well. And I think that's where it gets a bit more arduous when it comes to how much we have to educate folks on the true impact of brand and how brand works in those ways. Because I think when it comes to risk, one thing that helps make risk a bit more tolerable is to see the numbers and to understand what you're saying yes to and no to from a numbers perspective. And it shouldn't always be that way when it comes to brand decisions.
So this is a very interesting one because I think this ROI question is in essence like a control mechanism, right? Like it should be giving you some kind of control over an outcome that could potentially cost your head. So a lot of the stuff that I also suggest where, we talk about product-led growth, which also is in some kind of elaborate way a brand exercise, because what we're doing is we're putting our product first in your face instead of our promises. One of the most asked questions, at least in my cohorts, is usually about, but Leah, how do I get buy-in for this? Mm. And I do not have so much of a kind of a framework in like how you get buy-in to kind of change something, right? Like, because if you come to my courses, you're probably not doing it yet. So like you need to change something. If you change your brand, you're also saying goodbye to the old brand in some way. I think people need to be really aware of that this is going to cost someone's head if it goes wrong. It does not even mean that sometimes the decision to do something is wrong. It could also be that you're executing it wrong. And someone will actually take the brunt of that force. And this is why it's just sometimes so funny when I see, well, it's not funny, actually, it's tragic more, that you see operative ICs, like individual contributors and teams, just like thinking like, yeah, but it is so obvious. It is so obvious. But like if C-levels like me have to make a decision, you always have this phrase of like, nobody ever gets fired for, what was it, hiring IBM or whatever it is and so forth. And this is just a natural kind of result of how the org is working. And I think when it comes to brand, word of mouth, like anything in the market, it needs to happen from the CEO's level. It just does not work any other way. It cannot be a CMO decision. I'm pretty firm on this, by the way. Like it cannot be a CMO decision. It cannot be a CPO decision. It needs to happen through the entire company, whether you're sales led or product led. It just doesn't work otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's true. I don't think we marketers should be making brand decisions ourselves, especially for like purpose and mission and values. Like that should be a conversation with the founding team. I think what you said about like heads rolling for brand decisions not working out, what I've found is somewhat, I don't know if this is quite the exact inverse or not, but more often the case is that people take very safe brand choices, like they don't take the risk, assuming that, I don't know, they don't understand the risk. They don't have the tolerance for risk. They think the brand is something that is meant to be organic and we're good at brand just because for whatever reason, they're not taking the risk on it. And the head that rolls on that is the brand person's head still, because when it comes to resourcing decisions, brand resources are not thought of in the same way as demand gen or performance marketing or product marketing, because brand is just thought of as kind of this always on organic thing. You don't actually need people to do this if you're not taking the big risks and actually building a brand. And so what we see, like the heads that roll, they roll when it comes to like layoffs and resourcing decisions, is the creative people are usually the first on the chopping block for those reasons, because the decision makers are thinking of brand in a totally different context to how they're thinking of other parts of the marketing machine.
Yep.
And so I think there's risk on both sides. You can take a big risk with brand and then, yeah, you're kind of on the hook for whether that plays or not. But the opposite of that is you don't take risks and then your brand folks are still on the hook because they're not thought of as a valued resource within the team. So it's, as you can tell, it's like a very tricky spot for brand people to be today. Is you're either maybe an expendable resource when the time comes to cut costs, or you're responsible and accountable for making a risk that's going to pay off, hopefully.
Yeah, that's how I remember it also for marketing always. Like when times get really tight, it's usually the marketers that have to cut back on something, either their own salaries or it's the budgets that they have for their campaigns. It's just like, I feel like this is such a stupid relic from the older times where we're just like, oh, well, like if we have enough money, then just like dump it into marketing, right? Like this is definitely how we did business. But I actually do not think that marketing is anymore a thing that is just happening at the start of a journey. And then you have sales and then you have product. This shit is over. This is completely over. I'm actually thinking about like how the future companies look like, but they do not look like the ones that we have right now. It does not make any sense. It just does not fit naturally in how people are also experiencing brands and how they do product and so forth. I think marketing, specifically also brand marketing, is as much as a retention measure as you think about product to be something that is retention and so forth.
I could not agree any harder with that if I tried. I think like brand is so often thought of as like a nice to have. And I was just writing about this in our newsletter this week. It's like brand is thought of as like the thing you do, the thing you invest in when you already are successful. Like when you get to a certain level of fame and notoriety, then if you're Airbnb, if you're Google, if you're Uber, then you go and you dump a bunch of money into your brand. But actually, it's the thing that contributes along the way to that success. And you have to be tending it like a garden, not, okay, cool, now we have a bunch of money to spend. Let's do a brand thing for the first time.
Okay. So let's just go into something about, it's a little bit into the ROI question. Unfortunately, we have to go there because I also know the reality of the market, right? Like you need to give something that you can measure at least in some kind of way. And I remember, let's see where this goes. In 2022, I was attending a course on, I'm not sure whether it was on brand marketing or like just marketing in general on Reforge. And it did not feel right when they were telling me like, hey, so how do you measure the strength of brand? Because I also wanted to know, like, so how do you measure brand? Like how much do you get from referrals and so forth? Because I'm coming from product, I'm very used to this. And there were some concepts, like when you are going to compare yourself against other brands, like in all these surveys and so forth. And I wrote a synopsis of this back then on LinkedIn and posted about it. And one of my best friends nowadays, Elena Verna, was telling me like, Leah, this is all nice and everything, but check this one out. And then she links an article from Les Binet about the share of search. I don't know whether you're familiar with this, just like really, really quickly. You can use share of search as a predictor, as a leading indicator on how much market shares you will have a couple of months straight, like as a leading indicator. And it is absolutely fascinating how accurate it is for some industries. And it definitely works in tech as well. Like I will share this with you afterwards. I'm also going to put it into the show notes. It's an absolutely great thing. And the basic formula is relatively simple, right? So like the amount of share of searches is like the searches for brand so-and-so divided by the searches for all brands in that category will predict also relatively hard your share of the market. There are some exceptions, like if you fuck up royally and you're landing in the press for bad things, it's not going to give you shares, right? So like, don't burn down your product now. But I think there's a couple of frameworks that I feel like are very, very actionable. How do you try to figure out like, okay, we have to measure something. Okay, I'm going to believe you. This is a good exercise. We're going to do this. How long should I look forward to seeing the first kind of effects? I still want to measure something. If it's not money, what can I measure? How do you approach this?
We think you can measure anything and everything. And so the first principle that we think of when it comes to brand measurement is like, what's important to your company? Like, does your company care about hard ROI? Do they care about sales efficiency? Do they care about market share? Do they care about building a brand and getting lots of eyeballs on the brand? Like, those will dictate which path you go down. And so I love what you shared on this share of search. I think we think of that as like share of voice overall. And so search being one of the different quadrants you can pull from that. You can also look at share of voice across earned media and PR. You can look at it on social media, look at it across PPC. And so there's different layers of share of voice that we can pull. That's often when you're in like a very competitive space too. So you want to understand, how do you stack up versus the competition? If you're very early stage, maybe you just want a lot of eyeballs on it. And so in that case, we're looking at reach or impressions. And you can measure that across all the different channels you're investing in. And ideally, you're wanting to double that quarter over quarter. So you should be seeing results right away with an effort like that. With a share of voice, it's maybe 1 to 2 quarters, depending on what resources you're putting against it. If you have a really great PR firm, for instance, you'll see a lot more faster progress there. If you have a strong content team who's doing a lot of content and SEO, you might see it more on the search side. So it depends on what you're resourcing there. And then where I think it gets really interesting is when you get into some of the more like closer to revenue measures for brand. And I think this is what we've found that we had to go this far sometimes in the work that we've done together, is you can measure ROI if you have like a sign up survey. How did you first hear about us in that onboarding survey? And you can have different channels selected there. For instance, a podcast, that might be the only way you know podcast attribution is if you have like an onboarding survey or something like that, just because it's so hard to measure. But you can attach those to different channels. You can do some UTM tracking and understand like which channels contributed to signups that way. So you can kind of triangulate ROI in that sense in a more growth or demand gen type of way. You can also do it based on how much you're spending. And so the ROI of how much it might cost to pay for an ad on Fast Company, for instance, versus your brand efforts to get an organic placement in Fast Company. So how much did you save in that regard? So you can look at like CPM ratios there. We will look at like the types of traffic that you're bringing in. So if you want to count direct traffic as branded effort, so people are typing in your domain name and coming straight to you, they obviously know about you from somewhere. And you can say, maybe that's because of brand. You can look at that. You can look at branded search. So how many times are people searching your name on search and coming to your site that way? That's also another brand indicator. And then if you're a sales-led company, or if you have a sales component to it, we've worked through a system called buyer purchasing criteria, which is on those initial calls. You ask people like, why are we talking to? Like, how did you hear about us? And they have like this list of things that you then do like a picker in Salesforce or whatever tool you're using to say, yes, it was because of brand, or it was because of price, or it was because of this feature. And you can kind of understand, why are people even coming to us? You can attribute then a certain amount of your pipeline back to brand. And so that was a lot, but like there's a lot of different ways to do it. And so I think it depends on what's important to the business at the time, because you can find a way to do it for brand.
You can also measure awareness and sentiment. So you can do either biannual, or if you're a really high velocity brand, quarterly surveys on how many people know the name of your brand in your ICP and your target market without any kind of help. Like, they're not picking you out of a list that they've heard of you. They're just saying like, yes, cool. When I'm thinking about, I don't know, like task management solutions, I think about this company, this company, this company. There's also aided awareness where they're picking you out of a list. And then you can also do like questions about sentiment. So what words do you associate with this brand? Like, if you are familiar with it, what words do you associate with competitors? So you can kind of see how you stack up there. And if you care about, we want to be, let's say, the easiest to use in our category, then you can track over time how many people are using the words like easy or fast or simple whenever they talk about your brand, especially in compared to your competitors. So that's maybe on the more like softer, quote unquote, side of metrics, but there's still things you can measure and track over time.
I have so much to say on this, and I'm probably going to forget like 3/4 of everything that you just said. So with some of the things I agree, with some of them I have a little bit of trouble on the practical side. So what you just said, Shannon, I think I find it a bit expensive for like to really get meaningful results over these surveys, to get any like good results at a specific scale. I think they're working at it's true, but I think you need to be quite big for this to be worth it in the first place. And I need to meet, of course, like you need to already have quite a strong brand. I think to your point, Kevin, I think this is an interesting one. So I had Rand Fishkin on my podcast relatively recently, and we were talking about this as well. And he goes so far, and I think he says that paid advertising, mostly on branded keywords, for instance, is a total sham on Google, right? Like you're going to pay so much money for clicks that would have come to you anyways. I still like branded keyword analysis, not paid, right? But like branded keyword analysis to kind of figure out how much is our brand being searched for, but within the broader category. Like I like this share kind of thing again, right? Like I'm going back to this. And I also like how you also said it. So I think instead of me trying to just like push my subscribers on YouTube, I should probably put myself into a bigger pool of wannabe influencers that are doing sort of the same as me and see how much of this entire pool I actually have in a specific search. Because what it does is it really compensates for this overall market growth that you also have at the same time. It's not different than like you have stocks that are within a specific tech portfolio. Like, oh, yeah, look what a good of an investor that I am. I've made 10%, but then the overall stocks in that entire industry, they just probably grew 20%. So suddenly you're shit. And it's like, I think that's how I'm looking at it. And this is how I also try to make decisions on it. So, but I think these were some really, really great tips on how to measure this. But can I ask you very specifically, either of you, like, how would you do this? Like if someone asked like, hey, let's measure how strong we are on a very specific channel, right? So like measuring the brand on a specific channel. So like, let's say YouTube. Is this how you would approach it? You would probably lob in a couple of, I don't know, competitors or like similar kind of brands and then see like what the share is developing towards to? Or do you just look at the flat numbers in terms of like subscribers before, afterwards, the views and so forth?
I think it kind of depends on the goals again. I hate giving an answer that uses the word depends, but for me, it depends on whether you're playing a zero sum game or not. And so
Yeah.
a lot of the share of voice ones are assuming there's going to be one winner. And so you want the most people looking at you rather than looking at everyone else. I think when it comes to content channels or when it comes to like an influencer channel, I can follow multiple influencers within the PLG space. And so your share of voice isn't as important as how many people, more and more people are looking at you over time. And so I think that's how I would think about it is,
Oh, I disagree. You know why? I want to be the best, but you can keep going. Keep going. It's fine.
but
It's
you
fine.
can be the best and I can be the second best. And then you don't have to care about me. I think that's,
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, fine.
So you being the best doesn't change how fast you can grow and how fast others may grow. I think it's, again, it goes back to the goals. If you want to be the best, you measure that by you beating everyone else by a certain degree. Awesome. If you want to be the biggest, all you got to do is just keep getting bigger. And so I think that's how.
Yeah, but I have friends that are equally ambitious as me, you know? Like, I think the only chance that I could do to have a bigger brand than Elena, for instance, is like, I need to kind of give her something else to do. Just like send her to holidays or something.
Distractor.
It's so annoying. Yeah, sorry, but I interrupted you. I apologize.
No, we're kind of talking about this idea of infinite games. And I think that's a really interesting concept within the business world. So infinite games versus finite games. Finite games are games you play with like a strict set of rules, and there's a very clear winner and loser because we're all agreeing to play by the same set of rules. Business isn't always that neat and tidy. Influencers, content they're not always that neat and tidy. So what does winning mean? I think is different for everyone who's playing, quote unquote. So if winning means beating everyone else, then yeah, you're going to look at different metrics. But if winning means being the biggest, being the best, I think those are very different, like a different North Star that you're driving toward. And then you'll be measuring that in different ways. And so again, when it comes to measurement of brand overall, that's where the CEO's opinion matters. That's where the company's perspective matters. When you're doing it individually, it's where, what's important to you. I think that then dictates what you're going to measure and what you're going to look at as success.
Do you have an approach in case you end up on the point of we have two ideas of different brands for a company or like for a newer company as well that is not really in the market yet, right? So like we have two kind of hypotheses on like, hey, we could play it this way or this way. We have not decided yet. How would you suggest a company to test that out? Like, how should they do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that understanding what the kernel is at the I mean, this is going to get a little squishy, but like, what is the kernel at the heart of this company? Perhaps it's like the actual product itself and what it does, and it's amazing and transformative. And like, that is obviously like the clear thing that you want to like center the brand around. It could also be a founder and like the founder's story and their motivations and inspiration for like starting the company. And perhaps there's also going to be a lot of thought leadership that comes out of that founder. And so you might want to center the brand around them. It could also be there's a external cause or problem in the world that this company or product is like trying to address. You could also center the brand around that thing. The thing that is most important, and no matter what you kind of choose as like the beating heart of what you end up doing for brand, and the brand is not like a consensus. Like not everybody at the company is always going to be like, yes, I think this is the best choice. I think overall what you're looking for is something that feels the most authentic for the most people at the company, because that is the clearest, easiest path forward for everybody to be swinging with the same bat, speaking with the same voice, singing the same song. That if it feels like it's coming from a real place, whether that place is the founder's inspiration, a cause out in the world, a problem to solve, like an innovative product, if there's that clear, very authentic reason, then I say go with that over something that might be more exciting or feel more competitive or feel more current, like in the moment. If you can go with authenticity over those other sort of draws, I think you're setting yourself up for long-term success versus something that might be splashy in the moment, but that can't be maintained. I don't know if Kevin agrees with me on that, but because that's a great question. But
Yeah, I think your why should never change. And so I love that this example is we're coming up with ideas before we even go to market. Like the fact that you're talking about brand things before you go to market is just like music to my ears. But like the why, we shouldn't be deliberating on like which why do we think is more compelling. I think it's which why is actually true. And if there's something to debate there, I think it's more about how you're telling that why and the storytelling itself. And then once you're clear on the why, I think that's the authenticity piece for me. And then the framework that we described earlier with the different narratives, I think that's where you have room to explore and experiment. Like maybe you want to emphasize a product narrative first over a cultural narrative, or maybe you want to test them both and see which one resonates more. And then you'll lean one way or another. But all those narratives still bubble back up into this one authentic story, which is your why for existing. So I think that's the piece that you should be really clear about and shouldn't change. But then you have plenty of room to explore through the narratives.
So I've been writing an article on how to do product-led growth for different kind of brands and so forth. And one of the companies that I always quote for the ugliest interface and the dustiest brand that they just cannot get rid of is usually Salesforce. I'm really sorry if any of the leadership team is listening to this, which is probably not the case, but like I really love banging on them a little bit. I think it is interesting because this also goes a little bit into this direction of like Salesforce is really trying to kind of shake that, right? Like they're trying to shake away this, we're just for enterprise. We're just for upmarket. Of course, they always want to sell for upmarket. Everybody wants to sell upmarket, right? Like HubSpot wants to sell upmarket. But I think when it comes to the actual change that they have actually achieved, they tried to buy other companies with a cooler brand and a better distribution model that is actually more down market and so forth. I know very, very little companies that are small that are like, Leah, I cannot wait to get Salesforce. And one of the problems that they have is that just as much as a distribution model that you cannot change that easily, changing your brand also has an effect on your existing customers, right? Like you're starting to alienate the current revenue stream that you have. And I think this is what makes it so incredibly hard to kind of pivot your why. I think not only should you maybe not do it, Kevin, just as you said as well, but I think it's also in some regards, it's also impossible sometimes because you're moving with so much inertia already in some kind of direction. You cannot change anymore. It's just not happening. It's not that you cannot make an interface that looks good. It's just that, well, that means that your existing one will be all these integrations that all these bigger companies have built upon will not work anymore. And I think this is a very fascinating thing. It's like reinventing yourself or changing anything becomes so much harder when you're big. as a company, not as a person, right? So like, it's really, really fascinating. And I've seen this many, many times. So I think it's a very interesting kind of part of the industry when it comes to brand as well.
Yeah. Well, you think of the dichotomy between Salesforce and Slack, for instance, like those are very different brands. And yet, I mean, they are the same brand in a way, they're the same company in a way. Like I was on the Slack page the other day, logging in for something, and on the Slack homepage was this banner that took up like, I don't know, a good 20% of the homepage for Dreamforce. And I was like, I have no desire at all to attend Dreamforce, nor did I even make the connection that the two companies were related. I forgot. It was just like the strangest brand experience too. And so I think when big brands do buy smaller brands or try to steal some equity from these other brands, there's some bad ways to do it, and it can go really sideways. When you're that big, you're pretty entrenched. Yeah.
I can tell you exactly what happened. So here's what happened. They were sitting together. They were doing their balanced scorecard. We need to push, our MQLs in the marketing org from this one, like someone was mentioning the quarterly calls and the bad performance that they had on the MQLs. We need to get 2% more, Shannon. How are we doing this? And then the other Shannon, not this Shannon, because you're a good Shannon, bad Shannon says, how about we just use the homepage of Slack to get people to Dreamforce, and then we give them free socks, and then we have our MQLs. Bam, promoted. That's exactly what happened.
Yeah. And you can see how inauthentic that feels for Slack's brand, right?
It's still on the website, by the way.
It doesn't feel right. It's a violation of the trust and the relationship that we have with Slack for them to be hawking Dreamforce on their homepage. I'm sure I can think of like other examples of this where you stumble into this kind of like you put your foot in a bunch of dog poop, like that everybody can smell it. And because you aren't thinking from a brand first perspective, when the bad Shannon made that decision, they were not thinking about like, what is like the jarring brand experience that's going to happen when someone comes to this homepage, and it's going to prompt. And like now the three of us are talking about this on a podcast that has distribution to people in the industry. The three of us are talking about, wow, yeah, they like really didn't get it, did they? Like the Salesforce brand doesn't get it. And like that is brand. Like that is Salesforce's brand, is they are a brand that doesn't get it. And so that's what I mean about like being super intentional all the time, because like those brand like situations are happening all around you, and like people are talking about them like this.
Yeah, maybe it's not that advantageous if you're getting compared to dog poop. That is absolutely true. But if Ariel Kelvin, who's the CMO of Salesforce, is listening, you're very happy to appear on my podcast, and then I might be apologizing for bad Shannon. Bad Shannon said it's not good Shannon.
Yeah.
I think that's what it is a little bit. And this is just like so weird. This is to my point. Like, this is how we used to build companies. Like that's for me an example of bad marketing. There's bad marketing, there's bad product, and there's bad sales. And this is probably an example of how the underlying company works. I understand exactly why it happened, because someone said that we need more MQLs. And then someone said, okay, let's do that. There's a lot of traffic there. Let's piss these people off. Whatever it is. So I'm going to go to Dreamforce. Are any
See you at Dreamforce. That's the net of
No, wait. I wanted to log into Slack, but instead I'm going to Dreamforce. This is exactly what's happened. I mean, of course.
Naturally.
This is my life now.
Versus like you think of a brand like MailChimp got bought by Intuit, and MailChimp had one of the most unique brands in all of like B2B SaaS. And they've retained some of that. You can see some of the enterprise like Intuit brand seeping in a little bit, but like they even had an event this week, I think MailChimp did. That was a purely like MailChimp event. It was cool. It had neat like visual branding. It had a strong voice. And so there are ways to merge and incorporate in a brand way that doesn't steal some of that uniqueness from each other, or doesn't like make it all messier. I think that's one of the big things. Is like, I don't know that Intuit wanted to be cool by acquiring MailChimp. They probably wanted like an SMB audience is what they probably wanted, but they knew that keeping MailChimp as more of an SMB tool was smart, and they needed to have a different brand than the bigger Intuit entities. And so there's a lot of different brand thinking that goes into businesses when you get really big, and it's related, but oftentimes different when you're just like a single brand operating. You have a lot more leeway to do things versus like a Notion, which has its own universe. It's completely Notion. They can do everything that's pure and authentic to the Notion brand. When they get acquired someday, maybe it'll be interesting to see how that changes and evolves. But it's a different type of brand consideration when you're a single brand versus a bigger brand company.
I think Notion is very product driven though, right? But I also think that now with AI, because that's what you have to talk about as well, there's much more companies going to be around the same market shares. I honestly think that verticalization is going to be the future, which means that you also have less money overall in one entity bound. I'm pretty sure that's going to happen, just as we had back in the days when you had on-premise software, right? Like you had maybe one CRM player, that was it. And then the SaaS wave rolled in and all these companies are gone now. And now you have HubSpot, Salesforce, and the other bigger players and so forth. And I think that the same will happen now as well, like with AI companies, like smaller brands that are just like, they need to be also differentiated, right? Like they need to be specialists in something, because companies will just simply not sign up to 30 different tools anymore, because that's the other effect of verticalization. You have more different tools for different kind of use cases and so forth. So it's going to be very interesting how this is going to play out. And I think if I were a marketer, which I am not, I'm going to state this here, right? So, which I am not, I would say that of all the subcategories of marketing, I think brand marketing and product marketing, I think, are the ones that would interest me the most, because they're going to get so exciting going into the future. SEO and paid advertising and all this, like, I don't know. I think it needs to be broader, right? Like it needs to be about brand in general. That's going to be an interesting thing.
Yeah, we have a big belief that brand is going to be the main differentiator for marketing teams in the next few years. In the same way that product marketing became really big a couple of years ago, we think brand marketing is due for its time in the sun in this new environment.
I think there's an interesting point here to be made. So we know VCs. VCs love a lot of money. VCs love selling companies that are profitable. And I had an interesting discussion with someone in that they said, like, there is a fundamental misalignment between venture capital right now and what we see also on brand marketing side. So we are talking about founder-led brands, right? So like you have Adam Robinson, you have people like me who are just, we have a running business, we make a lot of money, we have good margins and so forth. But fundamentally what this means is that you cannot sell the company anymore without the founder, because they are such a big part of the brand. Because, I have the product team, but the product team is not as big as my name. That's kind of a problem if you start to sell the product to Shannon, because, no offense, Shannon, it's bad Shannon, okay? I've sold it to the bad Shannon, not to you. But that is an interesting kind of conundrum as well, because the way that we're looking at company value right now is really about like how much trust and, how much brand do you have also in the market in the future. But if you take it too much onto one person, you actually become harder to sell. Yeah. I don't know whether you have a point on this one.
Yeah, we actually were just talking with one of our clients about this, because they are a founder-led company that is getting bigger and wondering how to separate the brand from the founder. And our advice to them, and my advice to anybody contemplating this, is doing your best to codify the founder in an ethos, in a philosophy that can then be adopted by the company as a whole. And so if you get really sharp about how you talk about what makes your founder, and you are able to take that thing and make it into a belief system or a framework, or like we said, like an ethos or a philosophy that then everybody can kind of get behind. So for example, the branding agency that I worked for, Siegel and Gale, was actually kind of an interesting example of this. So Alan Siegel was one of the founders, and he made a big name for himself as like the simplification guy. Like this was like, kind of back at like he simplified tax forms and simplified like complex business processes, like big companies like SAP and ADP who have like lots and lots of stuff going on, or like big houses of brands or branded houses with like lots of these things, lots of like competing messages and stuff. And so his whole thing was simplification. And people sought out the firm, people sought him out. And it just so happened he had a firm doing this type of work. And so what the firm did, perhaps unintentionally or perhaps very intentionally, was they became now Siegel and Gale was the simplification firm. So you go to these people because simplification is now the headline, not Alan Siegel is the headline. And so they were able to negotiate that kind of like Indiana Jones like switch of like, just kidding, you thought you were going to get the guy and like now you're going to get the ethos. And I think like that's really the way to do it. But like you do have to spend some time thinking about what that ethos or that philosophy is. You have to get like a really strong executive comms and thought leadership platform that starts prioritizing the philosophy above the founder's story. And then you have to like filter that through your content strategy and your communication strategy. But there is a way to do it. You can make the Indiana Jones switch, but it is difficult.
I find that so interesting because the way that I try to also figure out that particular thing is something that I used to do without knowing it. So maybe I'm a marketer in after all. The way that I learn how to kind of figure out what differentiators are that people perceive. That doesn't mean that it is a differentiator, but the stuff that they perceive, so like the brand, is you just ask them to describe your brand to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And what's happening in that particular conversation shows you exactly just basically what you described before as well. This is what sticks. And then you see at least what your current brand strategy actually means to people. And you get a different answer from those that have just seen your marketing material, from those that have used your product. And if you have a misalignment there, then you need to either change the product or you need to change the marketing side. So those two should be very close together. Yeah, unfortunately, we have run out of time and we've been going for almost an hour. Shannon and Kevin, this was a lot of fun. Should people get in contact with you? And if so, how should they do that and where?
Yeah, please do get in contact with us if you want to chat all things brand strategy, brand storytelling, brand differentiation. We are at aroundthebonfire.com, where you can just send us a contact form, goes directly to us. So you'll have us directly on the other side of that contact form, aroundthebonfire.com.
Would you agree with that, Kevin?
I would agree with that. Yes. We also have a Substack if you want to hear more of our thoughts, like big picture thoughts on creativity too. And so it's aroundthebonfire.substack.com. You can find us there. We post once a week on big picture stuff.
Very nice. It will be in the show notes. Thank you very much for joining me. Thank you so much for listening to The Product Tea with Leah. If you don't have enough yet, you can subscribe to my podcast right now at Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or you can head to my website, leahtarin.com, which is leahtarin.com, where you can find much more of my material or just want to work with me.